thank you again for joining us. I have a great honor with Dr. R.G. Head is joining us. He's going to talk about one of his books, I believe his latest book, US Attack Aviation. So let's get this thing moving. Please pardon our dust. We had a dauntless roar in here a couple weeks ago and drop a bomb, so we've got some dust all over the place. So please bear with us while we do some fairly significant museum renovation. Okay, we have Warbird rides available to sign up for the adventurous. We talked a little bit about the flight ops. So again, it's real important from a safety perspective because a little bit after noontime, we're going to be spinning some props on flying airplanes out here. So grab that docent and, but hang around and see and hear and smell some living history going on out on our ramp later this afternoon. Okay, enough about me. We have two guest scholars with us today. Dr. Carol Hoover Head has a PhD in education counseling. She has taught in every grade level from kindergarten to college. She has specialized in getting high school kids into great colleges. And oh, by the way, she spent 26 years as an Air Force wife, to include time in the general officer ranks. That's not an insignificant task. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carol Hoover Head.
Hello, good morning, or afternoon maybe. I'm Carol, General Head's wife, and I'm here to tell you about the first time I ever saw RG. Have you ever heard of Ed Sullivan? Put up your hand if you ever heard of Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan was the most watched man on TV in the 50s and 60s. He was the first one to have the Beatles on. He was the first one to have Ed Sullivan on, Elvis on, and he was the first one to have RG on his program. Now, isn't that something? And you're wondering why he would have RG on his program. And this is the story. RG was flying the A-1 in Vietnam when he realized his tailhook and his landing gear would not go down. And so he tried every way to get it loosened up. So he called the tower and he said, it won't go down. And they said, well, drop your bombs in the ocean and we will foam the runway and then you can just slide right in. But there's a problem. The runway here is one of those with placards. Those are placards, you know, that you can run on them, but they would get, you know, they rip your tires to pieces. But you can go down to Benoit, where they have a hard surface, nice hard surface that they can land on very well. So he said, okay, well, I'll have to drop my bombs in the ocean and come in on the hard landing gear. But the Benoit, took an hour and a half to get there, even by flying. So he said, okay, well, I'll do that. So he started down to Benoit and just casually gliding along, not worried about anything. But now at Benoit, there was a lot of excitement. It just happened that there was a group of photographers there that were taking pictures of an F-5 that the Pentagon was thinking about buying for us. And so the photographers were there watching and looking at this airplane, and they were doing touch and goes. And so they could see what it was like and taking a lot of good photography because they wanted to take that back to the Pentagon and see what they thought. But when they heard that there was going to be a crash landing, well, that sounded like a lot better fun and photography than just regular F5 doing touch and goes. So they all ran into their corners, and they all ran every place, the photographers, and set up cameras so that they could get some good shots of this crash landing. So now, finally, RG, you could see it in the tape. Now they're taking, so how I could see RG for the first time was from these photographers taking these flights. And in the film clip now, you see this A1 coming in, coming down, and so, okay, so here comes, and you see the people putting in the foam on the runway, and you see RG and his airplane coming down in Benoit and finally hitting the foam. But before he hit the foam, his propellers hit the streamette and shoot lots and lots of sparks from the propeller hitting the ground, hitting the landing strip. So now, here we have it, our gears coming down. Now, one thing people maybe don't know, or most of you, the pilots, do know, that on an A1, it's an old Navy airplane. Now, Air Force pilots know that there isn't any kind of a tail hook on the bottom of their airplane, and a lot of fun is made to the tail hooker, you know the stories. And so, this was an old Navy plane. And so all RG did was call the tower and say, put the tail hook down, and so he could just come right in and grab it and, be fine. So in the little thing that Ed Sullivan showed was RG sliding into the foam, and then the tail hook grabbing the other tail hook and stopping really good. And now, my little pre-general, jumps out of the cockpit because it runs like crazy right into a photographer. Because, of course, he thought, it might blow up any time if it even caught a spark. So you see him on the little clip of RG. And, of course, I saw it. I just happened to see it. And you might have seen it also, because guess who else was on with him? Nancy Sinatra was singing Her Boots Are Made for Walking. So you probably might have seen RG in his little crash landing also. So that's how I saw my future general husband, RG Head. So.
Thank you, sweetie. Thank you, sweetie. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for being here. And right at the beginning, I want to tell you that I have two almost full authors right here. Ed Beakley, who flew A7 with the Navy, and Bill Thomas flew A7. Okay, we're going to talk about Air Force and Navy airplanes and their pilots. And then we're going to talk about developing the A7 and the world's best avionics system, which is used for dive bombing and navigation. And then we'll talk just briefly about the F-16 and F-18. Okay, first of all, I graduated from pilot training in 1962, went immediately to F-100s. All the top guys in the classes went to F-100s. And I was there 2 years, and I volunteered for Vietnam. I went to Vietnam as an advisor when there were only 17,000 men in South Vietnam. Before we flew with Vietnamese markings on the airplane. We flew with Vietnamese in case we got shot down. He could translate. And then in March, only 3 months after I got there, the Viet Cong attacked Pleiku and were throwing satchel charges in the Air Force barracks. And then President Johnson took off our markings. We're flying Air Force airplanes. We could fly alone, didn't need a Vietnamese. And then following my year in Vietnam, I was assigned to F4s at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and became an F4 instructor pilot. So the first thing, and I just put this slide in, Ed, the big difference between the Air Force and Navy pilots is this thing. It's not the airplanes, it's the aircraft carrier. Navy pilots are wedded to an aircraft carrier, and that's the way they get from peacetime into a war zone or into a peacetime zone overseas, and it makes all the difference. And I'll go ahead. This is a wing of airplanes, and look, there must be about 92 airplanes on that deck. They got them all up there. They've got A1s over here, A3s, A4s, AEW airplanes right here, early warning with radar. You've got F-8 jets over here. They're a composite wing of many different squadrons, small squadrons. Navy squadrons have 1/2 the number of airplanes as Air Force squadrons. Air Force squadrons have 24 airplanes and about 30 pilots. Navy squadrons have about 12 airplanes and 14 or 15 pilots. Now here's another big difference, and before I put the carrier one on, this right, I love this. I just absolutely love this. That's a 10,000-foot runway, just like the one we had at Benoit. It's all concrete. It's got two things. One I think the Navy invented first, which is an approach slope indicator. Right here on the left side of the is a set of lights that are set at the degree of the glide slope. So if you see a green light, you're high on the glide slope. You need to come down, and when you maybe it's a yellow high. Then you come down, you see a green light, and you keep it right there, and you're right on the glide slope. But if you're low, it's a red light. It's a combination of mechanical mirrors. Wonderful thing. We didn't have that when we first started flying F-100s. I didn't have it until we got to Vietnam. And then later, Air Force adopted all of them. Because all Air Force airplanes land at about a 2.5-degree glide slope, bombers, fighters, and transports. Now, and then when they formed the runway, first of all, right here, about 1,000 feet down the runway, we put an approach end barrier. Now, all Air Force runways have a far end barrier, but you don't want to go all the way down the runway because I had one gear up and one gear down, and so I decided to land with both of them up. But the way pilots get killed, one way, is to land with anything not up, either one down or none down, and you slide off the runway, the airplane turns over and blows up. Happens quite often, too often. And so, but that happens down to about 2,000 or 3,000 feet. So if you put a barrier in only 1,000 feet down, put a tail hook on the airplane, you catch that barrier, cable's about 1 inch in diameter. It's held off the runway by little donuts about 4 inches high. The tail hook grabs it, and the cable is restrained by 2 B-52 brake drums. As soon as you grab these brake drums are trying to hold the wire and you're trying to pull it. And so that's what happened. My prop hit the runway, flames and fire were coming up. I already had the tail hook, so I was slowing down. Then I hit the foam and the fire went out. I was still worried about 140 octane fuel blowing up because my fuel tanks were still full. The one on the right, I want to tell you, the big difference between Air Force and Navy pilots is this is beyond the imagination of an Air Force pilot. I mean, they just can't imagine why anybody would want to do this if you didn't have to. First of all, the lower shot here, well, let's take the upper shot. The airplane is looking through the gun sight. Even with a heads-up display, you can see some markers right here. And the chip's what, half a mile out, quarter mile out, Bill? Yeah, and that's all you see. Can you imagine what it looked like a mile out or 2 miles out? And they also, another difference is Air Force airplanes fly a 1,500-foot pattern. You probably have 1,500 feet here, don't you do? And from 1,500, you put your gear down and flap down, you come around and land. You have a lot of space. Navy, 500 feet. So you got all these airplanes orbiting the Navy. How many at a time? 10, 20 airplanes? All stacked up above the carrier in bad weather and at night. And they're all waiting. They come down to 500 feet, then they're on the landing pattern. And this is the best thing they see if they can see it. And they have radio aids to tell them where it is. You know, that doesn't always work. So now they're at 300 feet from touchdown. They're doing 140 knots, which is about 160 miles an hour. And they hope that they hit the runway. When they hit the runway, Air Force pilots go to idle power, and you slow down. Navy pilots go full power, because if the hook bounces over the wires, and there are 4 wires, he's got to be ready to take off again, and he's only on, how long? 600 feet of runway. He's only got that much airspeed to get, that much distance to get airborne. So he goes full power. So he goes forward goes back with the thrust of the airplane. He catches the hook and he jumps forward. They love it, must love it all the time. And Air Force pilots count the number of hours that they fly. I have about 3,000 hours, which is pretty standard for a fighter pilot. Navy pilots count landings, traps. And it's a big deal to have 1,000 traps. I think there's a special patch for a 1,000 trap guy. So, as I mentioned, that is pretty much beyond the imagination of an Air Force pilot. And the exchange pilots that I talk about in the book, when they had no practice but to go out and land here, had a hell of a time. So, slide, please. Okay, now, both Navy and Air Force started in World War I. Army Air Service was formed in the Signal Corps, if you can believe it. All the Signal Corps knew about airplanes was the balloons they started in the Civil War. But we got assigned under the Signal Corps. Now, I want to read a quote for you, and see where it is. A7. The quote is from General Spots, and he said, "We were different in the beginning. We flew through the air, and they walked on the ground." It was as simple as that. We were different. And the Navy and the Air Force both had a problem with their senior service. First of all, both the Navy and the Air Force started flying the de Havilland 4 airplane. Twin seat, fairly fast, great big engine, 200 horsepower engine. The engines were made in the United States. The Liberty engine, 200 horsepower, is made in the United States. It's the only U.S.-made piece of an airplane that got into World War I. We borrowed the plans for the DH-4, and we made some of those, and they did get into the war. So the 2-seat attack airplanes and strategic bombing began in the DH-4. Slide. Now, the Navy's problem in 1920 was they had to fight the gun club. How did you make admiral in the Navy in 1902? You were a battleship admiral. You weren't a destroyer. You weren't a submarine guy. There were barely any submarines, and God knows they'd never let one into a command position. So they were battleship admirals. Their thinking was as far advanced as the late 1880s. They were thinking in Napoleonic terms, and Admiral Nelson's big battle against Napoleon in the wars of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, they loved airplanes one at a time. And their idea was airplanes can get higher. The first U.S. action, in fact, the first action in World War I was a Royal Navy scout plane that saw the enemy fleet 15 miles away. They said, hey, that's great. These guys can do observation. The first mission was really observation. And then later it came to be artillery spotting, and then later ground attack. And some of the wise guys would often start flying single-seat fighters, but nobody paid any attention to them, except the newspapers. The newspapers locked onto the guys flying single-seat airplanes, and they became the heroes of the United States and Britain and Germany and France and everybody. So they got the glory. Now, so what should Naval Air do? It could be a scout plane, become a separate strike force, but you see the admirals, the battleship admirals, following Navy doctrine, were looking to win the war by a gigantic battle at sea. The gigantic battle at sea where the dominant force would sink the other forces and the other country would give up. Well, that didn't work too well, and there haven't been any really big wars at sea, none in World War I that I know of. But from the difference, from the beginning, the Army Air Corps was in serious debate with the Army with regard to should we fly our airplanes to support the Army in close air support and interdiction and bombing things around the battlefield, or should we do the strategic mission and go bomb the infrastructure behind the lines, rail lines, manufacturing plants, other things deeper. And even in World War I, there was a strategic aviation part. The British flew strategic aviation, and so did the US Air Corps. But which one of these missions was going to lead to an independent service? If the Air Force specialized in ground attack, they thought they'd never get away from the Army. And remember General Spott's argument? We were different from those guys on the ground. And a pilot's worst nightmare is to be commanded by a non-flying officer. And we passed a law, finally, in the 1920s, that pilots had to be commanded by another flyer, because only they would understand the problems that were being associated. And the Navy did the same thing. So, now, here's where the services they began together. They had fighter planes and attack airplanes, but now they begin to diverge. The Navy has developed a high-angle dive bombing technique. They're using fighter airplanes. It's a Curtiss Hawk. The C, by the way, stands for Curtiss. The Hawk is the F-6 airplane. As early as 1926, he found out that if you're going to dive bomb, you can dive bomb any angle, but 60 degrees is very, very accurate. What a steep dive angle does for you, it minimizes your 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock error, which are one of the big errors. Left and right you have to handle by wind, usually, but a steep dive angle. The Air Force started 45-degree dive angle, and we've never changed. We have doctrinal things also. But the Navy developed this steep dive bombing. 45 to 70 degrees. They perfected it in a set of fleet problems right here off the West Coast, where the dive bombers came in. They were so high, the fleet didn't even see them, and it was scored a terrific tactical success. The Navy kept that through World War II. And here's the evolution of Navy airplanes. DH-4 in the beginning. Now, the USS Langley, you know, was the first aircraft carrier built on the East Coast. It was a coal-carrying ship. It was the first Navy ship to deploy to Europe carrying coal, and the first Navy detachment. And when they brought it back after the war, 21 and 22, they converted it by taking off the smokestacks, and come up and look at this afterwards. And they didn't have any elevators. The airplanes had to be on the deck of the airplane, of the carrier. And that was the first aircraft carrier, CV-1, Carrier V-1. And it was based at North Island. And it participated in many of the exercises out here. And then there was one 1926, an airplane about to land on the USS Saratoga, and the BM, the bomber airplane. And then finally by 1942, they get to the SBD, Scout, Bomber, Dauntless. And this Japanese Kate is very similar to the Douglas Devastator that was the torpedo bomber for the United States in the Battle of Midway. And notice how it carries the torpedo. When the airplane's flying level, the torpedo is pointed down a little bit. These airplanes are slow. Torpedoes weigh 2,000 pounds. And the Japanese success at Pearl Harbor was because they practiced shallow torpedoes. They built a torpedo that would go under the surface and not go below 15 feet. And they practiced that in the Sea of Japan and in Tokyo Bay because they knew that Pearl Harbor was very shallow as a port. And they had developed the weapons to work in that atmosphere. We'll go to that a little bit. Here's the airplane that I flew in Vietnam, the AD, Attack Douglas, designed in 1943, first flew in 46 or 45 after the war, flew in Korea, and we flew them again in Vietnam. The Navy flew them in Vietnam until 1978, and the Air Force flew them until 1972. The carrier airway, that's 1942. Look at the airplanes. They see these Devastators? Those are carrying torpedoes. The fighter airplanes were the F-4 Wildcat, which was in Midway, the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, and the Devastator torpedo bomber. And if you go on the USS Midway down in San Diego, they have the only one in existence of the Devastators. It was rebuilt for the movie, The Battle of Midway. So it's a replica. There are none outstanding. Battle of Midway, June 4th, 1942. Ensign Hopkins is shown here because he was an ensign, which is the lowest rank in the Navy. He was the equivalent of a second lieutenant in the Army and the Air Force. He had less than 18 months service. He graduated high school at 16, college at 18, enlisted in the Navy, and went through pilot training, reported to Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, rather. And he is one of 34 ensigns in the Battle of Midway. So he is just learning to fly. He was flying with one of the Navy's best, a lieutenant named Best, B-E-S-T, who was a 1932 Naval Academy graduate. And he's flying in the Battle of Midway. They take off, they get the airplanes together, they're heading out, Now, there are 3 different bomb groups and torpedo groups headed for the Japanese fleet. One of them never saw anything and turned around and went back. One of them got diverted, and so when it happened, and in Hopkins' case, he's with a group, and since they're flying over water, they're very conscious of fuel state. And so they have a point of no return. And so they get a point of no return, which means that if you go beyond this point, you probably are not going to have enough fuel to get back to the carrier. It's halfway out. And you get back with a little bit of a reserve, but still, that's the point. So they pass the point of no return, and the flight leader carries on, and he carries on. And all of a sudden, he sees a Navy destroyer headed high speed back some direction. He's probably going back to the fleet. So they follow the destroyer, the sky opens up, the clouds open up, and they see the whole fleet, 4 Japanese carriers below them. Hopkins rolls in. They roll in at about 15,000 feet. They get in their steep dive. Speed brakes are out. Their dive flaps are out. He gets attacked by a Japanese fighter who comes in from the right. He dodges the fighter, drops his bomb, and heads for the water at 50 feet, starting back for the carrier. Another ensign joins on his left wing. Another ensign joins on his right wing. At 40 miles out from the carrier, one ensign's fuel drops out, he goes in the water. Hopkins notes his location. 10 miles further, within sight of the carrier, another ensign's fuel went up to 0. He goes in the water, he notes his position. When Hopkins landed back on the USS Enterprise, he had about a pint of fuel left, and he was only one of 5 aviators that landed back on the Enterprise after all those bombers and torpedo bombers had taken off. He had a good career, and he was the commanding officer here at Point Mugu, and he was there when Ed Beakley was there learning to fly the F-8. Now here's the story I want you to think about. These are the casualties of the Battle of Midway. The United States sank 4 Japanese carriers, all 4 of the Japanese carriers, and 1 cruiser. We lost a carrier. The Japanese attack did get to all of our carriers and really hurt the Yorktown, and the Yorktown finally rolled over and sank after they had a big fire, and there was also a destroyer that was killed. So these are the aircraft. The Japanese lost 320 aircraft and all their pilots, everybody that was flying. They had nothing to back and land on. The U.S. lost 150 airplanes and 317 sailors, but some of those sailors are those who would participate in the attack, ran out of fuel, ditched in the water, and were never recovered. Submarines picked up many of the pilots. Destroyers with the fleet picked up many more of the pilots, but we lost a good number of that 317. Okay, now, 1936, 1935. The Air Force, in the 1920s, there was a lot of writing in the US and Italy and all over Europe about the importance of strategic bombing. And since bombing was so horrific in World War I, people actually believed that bombing would make a country give up and surrender. They wouldn't want to go through a bombing attack on the civilian population. And that was the theory, and many people in the Air Force believed that theory and repeated that theory, so we needed a big strategic bomber force. And besides that, it was the only way to an independent service, because you don't have to coordinate with the Army if you're bombing 800 miles behind enemy lines. Now, at the same time, think of an Air Force. You have to buy fighters, you have to buy heavy bombers, you buy some medium bombers, and then there's this thing called attack. Well, of those, what's the priority? You had to have bombers, you had to have fighters, which were thought were necessary for escort sometimes, but not for the B-17, because the B-17 was as fast as the fighters in the 1930s. So the bomber guy said, hey, why do we need fighter? We don't need escort. We can outrun most of the things. The problem was they made the decision before the really big engines were developed in the late 1930s, and fighters became a lot faster, twice as fast as the bombers. But anyway, General Hap-Arnold, who was the chief of the Air Corps, said under present conditions, there's no such thing as attack aviation. And since the most useful thing on attack airplanes was dropping bombs, why not build twin-engine airplanes that are built to drop bombs, medium bombers? And so the Air Force did. We had a bomber competition in 1939, and out of that came the A-20, built by Douglas, the B-25, built by North American, and the B-26, Martin Marauder, built by Martin, and also the A-26, B-26, which was also built by Douglas. Those were the intended attack airplanes that the Army used in World War II. Now, what's the difference in a bomber, a twin bomber, and an attack airplane? Attack airplanes are used to flying low. They find targets, they look at the target, they can drop bombs, they can strafe. Bombers are not very good at strafing because they're heavy, unwieldy, they're not very maneuverable, and they're not very well defended against enemy fighters. An attack airplane has a pilot and a gunner in the back who's supposed to take care of the fighters. Now, Air Force fighter pilots, and that's one of the differences, by the way, all Air Force attack airplanes pilots are called fighter pilots. I was a fighter pilot, and when I was flying attack airplanes, I was still a fighter pilot. In the Navy, right after pilot training, guys decide, do they want to be fighter pilots and fly F-8s and Hornets, or do they want to be an attack pilot and fly Dauntless or A-7s? And there is a sign, reputedly, on aircraft carriers, a sign over the door of the fighter area, and says, fighter country, attack pukes, stay out. They're very tribal. And the attack pukes have their own ready room in a different part of the carrier, and that keeps them from having fist fights. It keeps the two tribes apart. So here's something about air superiority. See the P-51, he is leading an F-16 and an F-15. All those are fighter airplanes built for air superiority. Now you need air superiority, and the Navy agrees on that too. They just use a different airplane to get that air superiority. After we won the air war in Europe, we turned the P-51s and the P-47s into ground attack and let them attack German fighters on the ground. Part of the reason was they got credit for a kill air to air, and they also got credit for one on the ground. So this is the way most fighter pilots viewed their lives, in the glamorous atmosphere. And here's what I showed. So on the fighter line above here, you have the P-26, the P-38, P-51, P-47. They go to the F-86 in Korea. The F-100, which I flew, which was a Super Sabre, F-15, F-16, and now to the F-35. And notice how the divergence of designs here in the 1920s and 30s. These are Air Force attack airplanes, light bomber airplanes, A-7, A-10, F-15, F-16 are both ground attack. There's a version of the F-15, a two-seater. It's a wonderful long-range attack airplane, and they're converging here on the F-35. And the Navy converges there, and so does the Marine Corps. Now, here's another controversy. The services were always mavericks. The fighter pilots and attack pilots were always outrageous. They dated the best, the most beautiful girls. They had the biggest parties. They're the ones that you've heard about getting in the papers, especially with tailhook. Now, the Army in 1960, President Kennedy is elected. General Maxwell Taylor, U.S. Army, becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so the Army says, hey, you know, the Air Force is not responsive to our needs. We need better close to it. We told you in Korea you didn't improve things. And if you don't build a better close air support airplane, we're going to build an armed helicopter that flies 200 miles an hour. And we don't need you. We'll develop our own Air Force. We'll do close air support. Well, this is a threat to the core mission of a service. And Navy was not going through the same thing. They knew they needed fighter airplanes and attack airplanes. There was no big debate after they won the Battle of Midway. So, next slide. So the Air Force has the competition. Now, Carol told you about the F-5. You see the F-5 with the bomb load here? 3 bombs there, 6 bombs there, 3 bombs there. The range of this aircraft in that configuration is about 75 miles, which is not very good, not very good. And we knew that, but the Air Force loved this little airplane because it was supersonic. When you're not carrying bombs, it's a little dart, and it does wonderfully. And now we have a version of it in pilot training called the T-38. Well, the Navy had just built the A-7, and one of the things about the A-7 was huge internal fuel and lots and lots of bombs, 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of bombs. And it was a follow-on to the A-4. The Navy didn't have any problem developing this airplane. And so that was a candidate, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense was trying to get the Air Force to buy the A-7 for all of the years leading up to 1965. Now, the result of this computer simulation was the Air Force said, okay, we can buy the A-7, 3 wings, because we've got the F-15, and if we put a gun in the F-4, Air Force and Navy airplanes, first of all, the Air Force was forced to buy the Navy F-4, did not have a gun, because in 1950s, all future battles were going to be beyond visual range with missiles. And so here the decision, buy 3 wings of A-7s, put a gun in the F-4, and develop the F-15, the world's air superiority airplane. So all those 3 decisions were in the decision in 1965. So the Air Force joined the Navy. The Air Force didn't like the engine in the Navy. It had 10,000 pound thrust, which was not enough. The airplane was very heavy, especially with bombs. The Navy didn't particularly have a problem because they were catapulted off of the carrier. And that was, so you didn't need the extra thrust. The Air Force says, we need a better engine, and they did. They found a 15,000 pound thrust engine, 50% greater thrust. They put that in the airplane, and the Navy said, well, okay, yeah, we could use more thrust, so we'll go along with that. Second thing was, the Navy A-7s had 2 slide cannons. Well, slide cannons were built in the 1930s. They were used in World War II, 20 millimeter, but they're prone to malfunction and they don't fire very fast. The Air Force in 1954 had said, we're not going to use these cannons anymore. We have the rotary cannon that fires 6,000 rounds a minute, the Gatling gun, and we're going to put that in the F-4. We want to put that in all of our future fighter airplanes. Well, the Navy resisted this, but they said, okay, well, actually, it took a Secretary of Defense McNamara decision, and he ordered the Navy to go along with the Air Force and put in the rotary cannon. So the designer, the Navy captain that I interviewed for my dissertation said, with all the changes you have to make in the fuselage to put in the gun and to put in the new engine, that was the time to put in a better avionics system. Now, avionics or aviation electronics are what determine the navigation and the bombing accuracy of the airplane. And all the airplanes until this time had been opposite of digital, analog. Some of you have analog telephones. Analog telephones have a limited capability, and IBM was pioneering digital systems for take-home computers at the same time. And so the two Navy captain and Air Force colonel said, we're going to go around to all the aviation manufacturers and get them to bid on building a digital computer which will give precise information for navigation and very precise bombing information to include Doppler and wind drift, which is a big error in dive bombing. And so they did this. They also, the Secretary of Defense was opposed to it because they wanted to keep the airplane like the Navy had designed it, lightweight, low cost, and very reliable. But the Air Force had always wanted the more advanced technology. So they go along with the avionics change, and the result was the A-7D in the Air Force and the A-7E in the Navy. And both Bill and Ed flew A-7Es and can tell you afterwards about how accurate it was. The difference was combat accuracy in Vietnam by a study by the Air Force. Average bomb error was 420 feet. When we put the digital avionics in the A-7, an instructor with 3 student pilots in advanced training went out. They each carried 6 bombs. They had 24 bullseyes. The digital computer was that good, and it continued to be accurate. And they found out it's also really good for landing on a carrier because you can put the designator on the ship, and it helps you a lot to guide for landing. And the reason is it went to a heads-up display. Now, I drive a BMW with a heads-up display. It's got distance to the next mark. It's got the speed limit. It's got the speed you're going, and it tells you which way to turn. All that is on the window. This heads-up display has 14 pieces of information for the pilot. He doesn't need to look inside the cockpit when he's doing a lot of other things like air-to-air fighting or bombing. Now, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force that I interviewed for my dissertation never liked the A-7. He was forced to buy it because the Army was pushing him to get a close air support airplane. But what he really wanted was something like the A-10. And a group called the Fighter Mafia was formed. And they were a mafia because they were mavericks. They were against the traditional things. They thought the F-15 was terrible because it was too heavy. The F-15 was going to be a 60,000-pound airplane, and they wanted to design a 20,000-pound little Redbird that would do everything that the air-to-air F-15 would do. But in the meantime, they designed the A-10, and they gave it all the characteristics that the A-1 had earlier, not the A-7. They made it very maneuverable at slow speed, underneath clouds. The accuracy, here's a very unusual thing, Ed. They refused to put in the heads-up display and the avionics because they wanted to keep it lightweight and simple. But they did have a lot of armor. Now, the A-1 that I flew had armor under the engine, under the pilot, behind the pilot, and on the sides of the airplanes. I'm certain that's one of the reasons I lived through Vietnam. The A-10, the pilot sits in a titanium bathtub. It's all around the cockpit. The engines are armored underneath each engine, and they're far enough apart that if you lose one engine, it doesn't affect the other engine. So it turned out to be a great airplane. In fact, let me tell you a story. A-10 pilots have an inferiority complex. They know that they did not select to go to F-16s. They are not fighter pilots, even though they're called fighter pilots. They are attack pukes. And in the Air Force, they're one of a very small number of pilots. I mean, even the bomber pilots look down on them, which is incredible. They would look down on anybody. But so we get to 1985, it becomes, first of all, a group in England, a wing with 72 airplanes, flew 513 sorties in one day. They'd take off, fly to the bombing range, drop, come back, shut down one engine, refuel, take off again. 500, that's each airplane flying about 7 missions a day without being down for maintenance. You wouldn't fly if something serious broke on the airplane, but that's an incredible record. So in Desert Storm, the A-10s alone killed 997 tanks, 926 artillery, and 96 enemy radar sites. And General Horner, who was the air commander for both the Navy and the Air Force, General Horner had a son who went into the Air Force, went to pilot training, and instead of choosing F-16s, he chose to fly the A-10. And General Horner told his friends and his pilots he thinks his son is brain damaged because he doesn't think, like a rational person. I don't know what I'm going to do. Well, after the first week of the air campaign in Iraq, General Horner, with all the pilots in, and he goes around to each type of airplane, each tribe, and they get to say their piece. He gets to the A-10s, he says, I take back all the bad things I said about the A-10. They're saving our asses. He realized the need for a slower attack airplane that would do the job that was needed. And that's, the A-7 guys have this tattooed on their foreheads now. They all remember that quotation. So, remember the fighter mafia that developed the A-10? Well, what they really wanted was develop an airplane that's lighter than the F-15. Now, the Air Force's #1 priority was the F-15. The Navy's was the F-14. They were both built with the engines that were powering the F-111, which was a colossal failure, of too heavy and not very maneuverable. A high cost, very high cost. Mach 2.5, but who's fought a war at 2.5 lately? Fighter pilots who did studies realized you only need to go about Mach 1.4. Now, I've been, the first ride in the F4 is a Mach 2 ride, and you're clean, you have no fuel tanks, nothing. You perform a maneuver, you dive down, get your speed, and you go to Mach 2. Okay, you've been at Mach 2. But 1.4 is about all you need, and the F4, it turns out, is a tremendous turning airplane at 1.4. You take a MiG down to 1.4 and you can outturn it. It's the only airspeed at which you can outturn a MiG, the lightweight MiG-21s. Now, the air superiority guys, remember, heavy air-to-air, not a pound for air-to-ground. That's what they thought. Well, it turned out to be different. The reason was the fighter mafia was there, and three miracles happened to give us the F-16 and the F-A-18, by the way. First miracle was my classmate, Mike Lowe, and John Boyd, a maverick Air Force pilot who invented all this stuff. Mike Lowe was a major. He was just back from a combat tour in F-4s, and they're two in the fighter requirement shop of the Air Force. And so the boss of the shop, a colonel, found a $149,000 contract. So they let out this proposal to industry and said, we're going to build two prototypes, one twin engine, one single engine, and we're going to have a fly-off. McNamara is gone. This is a new administration. The Republicans are in power. Secretary Laird was, Secretary William Clements was the deputy secretary, and Clements believed in demonstrations. Build something and let it compete. Don't make all decisions by computer studies, which are suspect. So General Dynamics, Northrop, and Lockheed bid. GD and Northrop won the competition. They divided the $149,000 contract to each of them. And now, why would a huge multi-billion-dollar aircraft company bid on a $149,000 contract? Because you see a multi-million-dollar contract as the next step to the winner of the competition. So Kelly Johnson and all the top designers of these aircraft companies go to the Pentagon to these two guys and said, okay, we're here to help you. What are we going to do? He said, we're going to design a 20,000-pound air superiority fighter in secret, because we can't let the top brass know what we're doing, because that would threaten the F-15 and the F-14. So they met at night and on weekends at a Pentagon motel and designed two prototype airplanes. And the airplanes looked like this. The F-16, the Y means a developmental airplane test, which had fly-by-wire. Now, Mike Lowe, my classmate, had a year off from the fighter requirement shop. He gets a scholarship to MIT, and he writes his thesis on the advances that can be made in aircraft design by using a fly-by-wire system. Why is fly-by-wire better? First of all, you have 3,000-pound hydraulic lines in fighters and bombers. 3,000 pounds, they leak. They leak all over the carrier. They leak and they run out. They have two hydraulic lines, but in combat you get one shot out. But replacing all those with wires and little servos save a hell of a lot of weight. And that weight is available for other things. And so now the Northrop didn't go to fly-by-wire right away, but they had two engines. And these airplanes were very competitive. They're very lightweight. They're very maneuverable. They have a fly-off between the two, and the F-16 wins. So the Air Force buys the F-16, and then they have to missionize it. And the Navy was required by law to look at the winner of the competition. Well, they looked at, doesn't it look like an Air Force airplane? I mean, red, white, and blue. I don't even think the original ones had a tail hook on it. And the landing gear is very narrow. It's not much wider than the fuselage, which is the same as the A-7, actually, but it had a wider fuselage. The Navy says, well, it's only got one engine. We love two engines, because you're flying over the water. Secondly, it's got a very narrow landing gear. It's going to be, and also the tilt angle on a carrier, the aft part of the jet engine is going to hit the deck before the wheels hit the deck. So it's not built to land on a carrier. And thirdly, it was Air Force. And we don't want to buy an Air Force airplane. So they make Northrop team with McDonnell Douglas. Northrop was an Air Force contractor. They made them team with McDonnell Douglas, who had built the F-4, and together they developed the F-16, the F-18. Now they were going to have an F-18 and an A-18, But the digital computer, remember, back in the A7, was now advanced enough that they could put enough switches on the throttle and the stick. You didn't need a second pilot or a second crew member to work all the avionics. So you combine the two, and hence the birth of the FA-18. They started with the early ones, and this is the latest one, the Super Hornet. Now, the Air Force is stuck. They're going to buy F-16s, but now they start to figure things out. They've got the F-15, which is going to do the air superiority job. The F-16, it's wonderful. It's been designed for air-to-air, but you really don't need that much help because a lot of the business end is in the attack airplanes. We won the air war in Korea, didn't help the ground forces that much, and we did the same thing in Vietnam, but again, we dropped a lot more bombs than we did enemy airplanes. So at the same time, NATO says we need to replace our attack airplanes in Europe. So if the Air Force will buy the F-16 with a ground attack capability, we'll buy them. And they did, and there are 4,600 built. 39 countries fly the F-16. 39 countries that helped out with manufacture, and the Air Force it's still the main attack airplane in the Air Force. Around the world, we have more F-16 squadrons than any other type. Let's go back one. So we have F-15s, F-16s. The F-16s are air-to-ground capable. They're also nuclear capable, which was a side factor. And now you have F-16s, F-18s, and then together, now all the avionics coming together, all the data that's been developed in the last 30 years, the F-35 is a data airplane. It's like a mini AWACS. And Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps are going to buy the F-35. Foreign countries are now beginning to buy the F-35, and so it is the replacement fighter. So, in a modest form, I'll be glad to answer any questions. That is our modest 100-year history of Navy and attack airplanes. I'm sorry I've kept you so long, but we'll be glad to stay, and Carol and I will sign any of the books that you want. There are 63 photographs in the book. Ed and Bill will sign copies if you want. Now, we're so happy to be here to transfer a little bit of what we've learned in this Navy and Air Force story. So thank you very, yes, sir, question?
How much does the F-35 cost?
The F-35 cost has been increasing. It's over 100 million per copy. But the others are not cheap, but the Navy is going to buy a lot more Super Hornets now because the F-35 is coming on so slowly. They're buying the Super Hornet to fill in the gap.
Hey, RG, would you please repeat the question when someone asked it to you? Thanks
Yeah,
so
the
much.
question was, what's the F-35 cost? And over 100 million, maybe 120 million now, and they're not finished designing it. Next question. Question? Yes, sir. No, we're only at generation 5. If the generation 5, the question is, what does the F-22 fit into this? Remember the Air Force's love, remember the P-51, F-51 slide? The Air Force still loves air superiority. And before the F-35 was designed and came on board, the Air Force said, we're going to build a really supersonic cruise, high maneuverability, air superior only airplane, and that's the F-22. And it's the F-22 that shot down the Chinese balloon when it went across the United States. So we have F-22s based stationed around. Some are in Okinawa, some are in Alaska. They're on the forward periphery, and we have some here for training in the flight of Europe also. So that's where the F-22 fits. Unfortunately, it will not have all the data that the F-35 has, and so the Air Force realized they can't really, it's very expensive. It's close to 100 million each. So they've reduced the buy of the F-22, but we're going to have them for some time as well. Good question. Yes, sir.
I work with a lot of cadets that
Yes. All question was, how do military people, how did I receive my education? The Air Force sent me for a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And I will tell you that all the services are dedicated to education. Even the Army, which is the least sophisticated of the services, values education, because you can become a fighter pilot in the Navy or the Air Force, and you can fly for 4 or 5 years, or maybe 6 or 8 years, but if you don't get a master's degree, your career is going to be limited, because most of the smart guys take the year or two it takes and get a master's degree, either in engineering or mine's in political science. I was a policy analyst during the Cold War and thereafter. And the Air Force, the PhD is really hard to get. We only have 400 PhDs in the Air Force. So, but I was going to teach at the Air Force Academy, so the head of my department said, "You're at Syracuse, you've done well in your master's program, do you want to stay for a PhD?" Because they have a requirement for a few PhDs in the service at the military academies, Navy, Air Force, Navy less, because you have more civilian professors at the Naval Academy. But all of the services value education and will give you time off to get a degree. They need advanced engineers and all skills. Good question. Yes, sir. We think it's the best airplane in the world. We won't know because so much of it is in the black world of data and counter data and attacks and so forth. It is so smart that the F-35 can take F-15s and F-16s on the same flight, and it's feeding them information about what it sees, and what it sees the whole enemy air defense network and all the countermeasures that are being thrown at it. And it can also take 500 drones and target them, air-to-ground drones or air-to-air or air-to-surface submarine. They have that much data that they can control. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the only one, they have about the same avionics. The difference is only the Air Force has a gun. The Air Force kept the gun. The Navy went back to it will do it with missiles again. And the Marine Corps has a gun, but they carry it only as a pod. They didn't have room with the big swiveling engine that the Marine Corps needed for a short takeoff and land. Good question. Again, crowd's full of great questions. Here's the pilot. Let me give you a sense of the question is, how is the F-35 advanced in terms of avionics and aid for the pilot? The first aids for the pilot were in the avionics system, which gave him a heads-up display, which put a lot of the traditional data up on the windscreen. That was a big help. The next thing, which was advanced in the A-10, was if you can develop a target designation system, don't limit it to the head screen or to the heads up, have it slewable and have it point out a point on the ground and put that on the pilot's visor. So what's happened is a lot of the data that was originally on the windscreen is now on the pilot's visor, including the location of his wingman, the location of anti-aircraft artillery, the location of SAM shots, surface-to-air missiles, and the location of the target and the wind and the drift and all those things. So the data is getting to be relayed more quickly to the pilot. And also we're getting pretty smart drones too. But the drone can't do what a pilot can do on the scene to see what is actually there. And so we're going to have a marriage of the two. And future air battles or air-to-ground battles are going to be much different than those that we've experienced in the past. Yes. That's right. Question of what difference is artificial intelligence going to make in airplanes? First of all, you already have some artificial intelligence with the avionics system because there are some smart decisions that are being made as to what is going to send up. Let me tell you something about AI. The answer is we don't know. And here's the reason. European Union this week is going to place a law on the books that says you need to label things that are AI and differentiate them from things that are real. So you're going to have to label data that is real, and I don't know what we're going to see a definition of that, versus data that has been manipulated by artificial intelligence. And this is supposed to help the consumer decide what he wants to rely on. We're going to see a lot of mistakes as AI develops into our daily lives. So, excellent question. The answer, we don't know. And you'd have to be a current pilot, you know, to be able to answer that. That's the end of my 100-year experience in the book. Yes, ma'am. Favorite was the F-100. Well, two favorites. The most comfortable airplane was the F-100. And the reason is, you've got a throttle stick, the airplane's very maneuverable. It could get out of control, but you knew how to not avoid that. You could fly the F-100 with your forearm on your right knee and your hand on the stick. And that was very comfortable. My roommate lives up in Santa Barbara, we were just with, flew a 12-hour mission from Florida to Turkey. 12 hours, 6,000 miles, with 7 air-to-air refuelings. He got an air medal for that flight. We deployed a whole squadron over there. That was a great airplane. The most fun airplane was the A-1, because I had flown in high school, and I learned how to fly a tail dragger by flying Piper Cubs and Moroccan Champions. So when I volunteered for A-1s, they said, hey, you're going to love it because it's another tail dragger, and you're one of the few guys that knows how to take off and land on an airplane like. And the trick is that you have to lock the tail wheel straight when you're going to take off, because if you don't, you're going to go huge torque, and you unlock it for taxiing, so you have more maneuverability. So with 10 hours in the A-1, I felt you could do anything with it. It had a wonderful dive bombing system, wonderful. We had 4 guns. We could fire 1 at a time, 1 of 4. We had 12 bomb racks on the outer wings, 3 in the center, and you could drop 1 bomb at a time, or you could drop them all. And we had a switch that would determine all of that. Very, and a wonderful gun sight. It had everything. So it was ultimate air-to-ground airplane. Yes, sir. Sir, did someone pay you to ask that question? He said, what's my longest airtime in the A-1? We carried a centerline fuel tank all the time because that extended our range from 3 hours to 5 hours. And I have 2 5-hour missions over North Vietnam out of Thailand in 1 day. We were looking for down pilots. We started the Sandy program, and we were up there looking for an F-101 pilot that had been shot down doing reconnaissance. And I was up flying in the Black River in and out of Cloud Bank, hoping the next turn around the bend would have a place that we could get out of the valley. Thanks for the question. Any more questions? If not, we'll be here. Carol, I'll be here. I'll be glad to sign your books. Thank you so much for coming and supporting this museum. And thank you.
Great job, Dr. Outstanding. Thank you. Okay, quick wrap up here. So again, I'd like to reiterate that Dr. Head and Carol will be up here with some book signings. If you please, a shout out early for a happy Father's Day for the fathers among us for tomorrow. Our next presentation is about a month from now. We're going to talk about the primary training syllabus back in the day, late 30s, early 40s, and we'll have our PT-19 on display. And then after that, into September, we have a T6 that we know of in Las Vegas, and we have one of ours, this one, who celebrate their 80th birthday this year. So we're going to have a birthday party. Okay? And kind of a shout out to next year. 2024 is the 80th anniversary of D-Day in June. So we're trying to keep up a little momentum towards trying to have something bigger next June relative to D-Day. Those of us who were here in March, a couple months ago, this group of DC-3 C-47s, which flew to Normandy in 2019 to celebrate the 75th anniversary of D-Day, well, they're at it again. So they're crowdfunding to try and be able to get the money to go do it again next spring to celebrate the 80th. And I want to try and keep that in our minds as we prep towards D-Day 80th next year. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the museum. Thanks for your time.